Hey folks, this is Abel James, and thanks so much for joining us on another episode of the Fat Burning Man Show, where we talk about real food and real results. When you're assaulted by negative news, do you know how it affects you? The media that we consume does startling things to our brains, our bodies, and our spirits. And today we're here with a Harvard neuroscientist and a good friend, Dr. Srini Pillay. Always a favorite guest. Dr. Pillay is assistant professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, an accomplished musician, author, and award-winning poet. He is known for combining head and heart, figuratively and literally, to combat the stresses faced by ambitious and high-achieving people in academia, business, and life. Today, he's here to talk to us about burnout, a huge issue. He's going to talk about how to use neuroscience in the workplace, as well as the importance of developing different parts of yourself. Before we get there, here's a review of the podcast that just came in from Tanya. She says, "Just want to say that I enjoy listening to your podcast. My family and friends think I'm weird because I'm interested in health and anti-aging. I started training for my 18th marathon, and your podcast gets me through the miles. My mother is 86 and refuses medication for her few health issues, all diet. I hope I can convince my family and friends not to follow the norm. Thanks, Abel." Tanya, thank you so much for writing in and explaining some of this. I'd like to dig in, actually, because you said some very interesting things. You said, my family and friends think I'm weird because I'm interested in health and anti-aging. Isn't that crazy? I totally agree. It happened to me too. Now I tend to hang out mostly with fellow health nuts, but especially at the beginning, they're just like, you're weird, you're doing something weird, you're going to have a heart attack. Meanwhile, a lot of these people, including the doctors who are saying these things, are overweight and probably going to have a heart attack. So it's fascinating, the world that we find ourselves in. But as I've said before on this show and in my books and other things like that, get used to being the weird one. Embrace it. Be the fool. It's important because once you learn to go against the grain and not follow the crowd of lemmings that are jumping off a cliff right now, you learn so much more, and you can become more independent, more of a sovereign person, more self-reliant. And that is so important because if you just follow the norms these days, it's not pretty. Just look around. People are dying. People are sicker than ever. And we're talking about kids too. So we all need to be a little bit more conscious of how can we live in a cleaner, more healthy, and, spiritually aligned way, I would say. So anyway, it becomes more and more fun over time to become the weird one. And I can say that Srini on this show is definitely one of the weird ones. In fact, a lot of my guests and my favorite guests are the weirdest ones. So double down, get weird. It's much more fun. Okay, so if you'd like to write in and share your story, please just shoot me a note at abel@fatburningman.com. And pretty soon we're going to set it up with text messaging and stuff like that too, because we're going to get all technologized over here for the new year. But for the time being, the best way to get in touch is to email me at abel@fatburningman.com. But even better, go to fatburningman.com. You'll find an archive of over 200 of these shows completely for free without outside advertising with full transcription. So if you want to read it, watch it on video, or just listen on audio, it's all there for you, even if I'm being censored on other platforms, which I definitely am. So be aware if I suddenly disappear. Go to abeljames.com, fatburningman.com, or go find my books on Amazon or what have you. I will not disappear. Now, speaking of weird, I finished my book of silly poetry, and it's been going really, really well. We just launched. We've already hit #1 hot new release over in the UK and #1 bestseller in humor over in Germany. So we're hitting #1s in multiple categories across the world. And I really appreciate your help, because this book seems, especially on the surface, very different from the other things that I do. But I think once you read into it a little bit, you'll find that the themes definitely flow throughout this podcast, the music that I do, and the rest of my books. So definitely go check out Designer Babies Still Get Scabies. For a limited time, you can get the audiobook for free. All you have to do is go to designerbabiesbook.com, and then that'll give you all the details, and we'll hook you right up. We're giving away over $1,000 in prizes. I'm autographing books, sending them out to you with a bunch of really cool freebies, as well as if you're into Kindle and reading ebooks, I'm giving away a bunch of my books over a half dozen of them on Kindle that you can read for free throughout the next few months. So make sure you're signed up for the newsletter so you know exactly when I'm giving away those free books. Now, let's get to some of the reviews for this book and some of the words that came in from people who you might be aware of, including Rob Wolf. He said this about Designer Babies. In a world that takes itself far too seriously, Abel manages to both poke fun and provide insight if one is willing to go on the adventure. We also have a quote from Srini. Let me grab it from this book right here. So Srini is the guest, of course, this week, but make sure to check out his past interviews on the show as well, because as I said, he's one of my favorites. So this is what he says, Dr. Srini Pillay. Abel James shares his playful and satirical side through remarkable poems that make you laugh out loud. It's as if you're reading a limerick while also feeling like you might have just entered the mind of a brilliant commentator on society and life. The poems feel like a tease or tickle from someone you love. If you want to feel loved or smarter or laugh a little harder, get this book. Dr. Srini Pillay, Harvard neuroscientist and best-selling author. So if you're interested in helping us out, your reviews, even if you get a free book and you help share it around with other people, but certainly if you purchase this book, it helps us keep the lights on. So we really appreciate it. Don't forget to leave a review and let me know what you think. Now, just fair warning, some of you will not like this book. I'm quite honest in certain parts. And if you don't like this book, that's totally cool. I don't expect you to like absolutely everything that I do. But as you'll see on this show, as Srini describes, it's very important to take risks, to express your truth, to stand behind your truth, even if you disagree with yourself sometimes, even if you're not always right. You've got to take those risks. You've got to be creative because in this modern world, they're teaching us and conditioning us to be slaves, to be lemmings, to be unhealthy, to be dependent on the system. And we don't need to be dependent on systems that aren't serving us. We need to be more self-reliant, especially looking forward. So anyway, designerbabiesbook.com, get all the freebies, don't forget. And if you hang around till the end of the episode, I'll even share a few poems from this new book with you. All right, on to the show with Dr. Srini Pillay. In this episode, we're chatting about the neuroscience of great leaders and how it relates to your business, what to do about burnout, depression, and anxiety, how to be different and get away with it, the importance of developing different parts of yourself, and tons more. All right, let's go hang out with Srini. All right, folks, always one of my very favorite guests. Dr. Srini Pillay is assistant professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and many, many other things. He is known for combining head and heart, figuratively and literally, to combat the stresses faced by ambitious and high-achieving people in academia, business, and life. Srini is an unabashed dabbler, a polymath, an accomplished musician, an award-winning poet as well, who frequently exports insights from neuroscience and other art forms, such as a new program that will combine neuroscience and music for use in corporate development. Dr. Srini Pillay, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Abel. It's always lovely to talk to you, and I always feel like I have a friend somewhere in the universe who's traversing the same pathway in this meaning-making conundrum. Yeah.
I know exactly what you mean. But we don't get to catch up enough. But one thing and one potential reason why is because so many people are so busy with so many things these days. You could argue maybe more than ever. One thing that no matter kind of where you are on the spectrum, from the most famous to the not, we're all kind of burnt out. We're feeling that. And so I know it's one of your focuses right now, and we were talking about Lady Gaga before we started this interview. So maybe we just start with that example, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I was reminded of that example because I think when you were talking to me about sort of how your life became better, one of the things that you said was that you get to say yes to the things you like to say yes to and no to the things that you like to say no to.
Yeah.
And this reminded me of a video that I sometimes will show in corporations, which is a moment of realization that Lady Gaga had when she suddenly said to herself, like, I maybe I don't like singing, which is sort of crazy because she's so good at it.
Right. But
she had reached a point in her life where she just didn't want to do this anymore. And then she started to think about it deeply. And what she said was, I suddenly realized that I don't like selling perfumes. I I don't like taking selfies. I don't like, checking my texts all of the time. I have much more to offer the world. And so she decided to say no because she was starting to feel like a money-making machine, just making money for other people. And so, when she started to say no to things, in her own words, she said she would go home and look at herself in the mirror and say, "You, I can sleep with." And in her words, she said, "Because you've got balls." And what she felt was that because she had integrity, she could now say no to things she wanted to say no to. She suddenly felt a greater degree of lightness because she realized that most of us are unconsciously living out a lie. And it was just such a profound statement, and it made me think certainly about what is the stuff I'm saying yes to that I don't really want to do.
Because it's usually automatic, right? It's usually unconscious.
Right. And so so whenever I work with people in corporations, I'll ask them, are there two things you could be saying no to in life? And when I ask anyone that, and I would ask anyone who's listening to this to ask themselves, is there something they could say, I don't want to do that anymore? Too, because I think the moment we offload this unnecessary stuff, we free up brain space to be able to do stuff that we really love to do and that we could be good at if that brain space was not occupied by nonsense.
And you even mentioned an example from your own life, which is social media. It's like as much as you want to be out there connecting with people, and I'm in a similar boat, you don't want to be scrolling on that news feed or that feed in whatever app we're talking about, looking at 1 out of every 5 sponsored manipulative posts that's trying to trick you and make you feel less than yourself and make you feel like you need something. That's all seeping in there. So what are some things that you do to kind of say no in your life? Whereas, I mean, that's a good example to keep going with, because a lot of people say, well, you can't avoid social media. You need to be on it, right? You have a business, or you're a person, or you're a personality, and how could you possibly exist without it? So how could you? What do you do?
I mean, I think I like to share things with people, but I don't like to invent mood states. Like a lot of my passion for what I do comes from the experience that I have and the stuff that I write and the stuff that I read. And I don't like to force that on people, and I don't like to say it's the only truth, so you have to love me. Like, I don't feel like you actually have to love me in order to read something that could be helpful to you. Yeah. So for me, I think my social media style changed from, because I worked with a lot of people who said, you really have to engage personally with your audience. And I feel like that's kind of fake because I don't know my audience. And, it's sort of like I have a sense of who they are, and I know they like to feel known. And of course, I want them to know me for what I do. But I'd like it to be real. Yeah. And so what I did was I've changed a lot of my style of posting to just wrote this. This is what it's about. Hope it's helpful. And I don't think it's sort of a massive success in terms of what it could be doing. I think if I did more Instagrams or videos on Instagram, it probably would give people a better sense of who I am. But I feel like I need to grow to that point where someone else is taking care of thinking about that. Because for me to think about how I want to appear in front of people, that's just it's a level of conscious thought that just messes everything up. Because I think totally. You know me well enough to know that when I'm somewhere, and what works is when I'm me. And the message that I want to communicate to other people is that what works is when they are themselves. Yeah. So I feel like when you try to think, well, should I come off as this, or what should I be wearing? As you know, I'm an eccentric dresser, so I was like, should I wear a jacket? Should I wear this? I wear all of those things. So why do I have to pretend to be a certain kind of someone? And why should anyone in the world pretend to be that? So I think with social media, it's beautiful to share. And like anything, there are pluses and minuses. I think it really is awesome to be able to say to someone, this just happened, or I just wrote this. But I think that the more authentic we can stay, the better it is for us and the people we're connecting to.
And that makes me think of one of the first times we hung out where you were just wearing the most spectacular, like rhinestone boots or something like that. And that doesn't, at first make you think he's saying no to something because it looks like a yes. But what you're saying no to is the norm, right? What you're saying no to is like the tendency to be like everyone else, to keep the peace, to, wear the same hat and the same jacket and the same everything as everyone else. You're saying no to that, and that takes more courage than most people probably realize.
Yeah, I mean, and sometimes people will say to me, "Don't you ever just like wear regular jeans and a t-shirt?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I do." For me, a lot of life is just about having fun.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean I have fun all the time, but when there's an opportunity, I like to take advantage of that and have fun. And so the idea of trying on different clothes, of experimenting with all kinds of things in life is what matters to me. I think for a lot of people, there are, we all have different levels of experimentation we want to engage in. Like some people don't want to experiment. They want to be staid. I think that's cool if that's your comfort zone.
Mm-hmm.
But I think as long as you're asking yourself the question of, do I want to be in this zone or do I want to be somewhere else? And as I grow through this life, how do I want to grow?
Mm-hmm.
Because too often, I think people, don't realize that they've just ignored who they are through most of their lives. The self goes completely ignored, and as a result of that, they end up being some version of who they think they're supposed to be. Mm-hmm. And as you and I talked about, this whole notion of like the fact that I play music and that I work in the corporate sphere, that I'm a psychiatrist and that I have tech companies. Most people are like, how could you be doing all these different things? Well, because I've worked for a substantial part of my life in each of those categories.
Right.
And I'm a connector and I like to connect things. And the absolute truth is I probably don't know why. Because if more than 90% of brain function is unconscious, I probably only partly have an idea of why. And it's one of the reasons I'm often reticent about this notion of giving advice.
Yeah.
Because I feel like successful people are the worst people at giving advice because all they tell you about is what's conscious. They'll say mm-hmm. things like, well, I worked at it because I really had a lot of grit. But, if you actually look at the research on grit, I think Angela Duckworth's done a beautiful job in framing the advantages of grit and saying that it really matters to be conscientious and to have some consistency of effort. But Marcus Creedy did a meta-analysis on grit recently and made some pretty valid critiques. I mean, he basically said that when you look at the correlation between grit and success, it's actually very poor. Like a perfect correlation is 1. And the closer you get to 1, the more it's correlated with success. Well, it turns out that grit's correlation with success is between 0.18 and 0.2. And so it's not a strong correlation with success. And so when successful people tell you, I did this because I had grit, and also a lot of the figures around that are a little inflated. Like there was a study done, it was people in the military, I think, who had to make it through some challenge. Mm-hmm. And what they said was something like 99% of people who had high grit were able to do this. But what they didn't say was that 96% of everybody else were able to do this. Oh. So people, and I think another good example of listening to successful people, but listening in the wrong way, is they will often tell you that deliberate practice is the way to go. That practice makes perfect, and if you do something over and over again, you're likely to become good at it. Now, that's such a believable thing, right? I mean, when I think about music, I'm like, wow, because I practiced a lot, I was able to sort of get a certain sense of mastery over it. Or when I think about, like what happened with my academics, when I was learning psychiatry or brain science, I read a lot. Right now, I spend a lot of time doing stuff.
Yeah.
But if you look at the research in this, Brooke McNamara at Princeton did a meta-analysis to ask the question, how much does deliberate practice correlate with success? The highest figures are in the 20%. So if you look at your success pie and you cut out a piece of the pie and you say, how much of success is due to deliberate practice? The highest level of that is actually in the 20% in music and sports. For jobs, for education, it goes down to 4%. And for jobs, it's less than 1%.
Wow.
Which means that people who are good at their jobs are not necessarily good at it because they do it a lot, which is such an earth-shattering thought, right? Because, the reality is that, I respect both sides of the argument. There are studies that probably show the opposite of that. But I think they make us ask questions. If grit is not enough, and if deliberate practice is not enough, what else do we need? And I think we need not just psychological constructs and methods. We need to be part of anything that we're practicing or anything that we're doing conscientiously. And if we are just following somebody else's advice, then we actually leave ourselves out. It's like imitating someone else's life.
Right.
So that whole sort of monologue was really to emphasize the fact that successful people usually only report what they do consciously. They don't really tell you about what's happening unconsciously, and that deliberate practice and grit on their own are not enough to manifest success. And if we think about all of these things and what you and I are talking about implicitly, right? I mean, at some level, we call ourselves dabblers because we're working in different fields. But there is a kind of intensity that you bring to your poetry, for example. Like I read a lot of that poetry, and I was like, this is not like dabbling-ish poetry. This is a guy who is operating from some kind of primitive core and is able to channel it through an artistic medium and bring together his various interests in a way that feels alive. And so I feel like I think the more we can access our primitive selves, the more likely it is that we will be successful and more creative.
As long as you don't paint yourself into that box. It makes me think too of something that I'm taking jazz lessons from one guy over in the UK and then a few guys in North America, kind of a DIY grad school arts education is what I'm after. And he said something really interesting because he went to conservatory over in the UK, and there were a ton of solid players there, real cats. And he said something interesting happened. And now he's, 15, 20 years out, something like that. And something interesting happened. Whereas, when you're in conservatory, the best players are at the top of the world, and they're, just honored as gods and all this other stuff. But after school, when you entered the real world, whatever that means, a few years out, that switches, he says. It's really the ones who were able to engage the rest of their lives and develop some sense of entrepreneurship, some sense of maybe, I don't want to say marketing yourself, but especially for musicians, you need to put yourself out there and you need to be good at that. That has nothing to do with moving your hands with great precision on an instrument, right? And so it's really much more about this holistic approach where you have to take disparate parts of yourself and develop these disparate parts and hopefully, like you were saying, get to some sense of wholeness.
Yeah, I think what happens when you are connecting these disparate parts of yourself, as opposed to ignoring them. Mm-hmm. Like I often will say to people, so if you like cooking, and you also work in technology, or you're working with a social media company, and you like hanging out at the beach because it's something that just makes you feel good in the summer, like I think you can make a life combining those different things.
Yeah,
and not in a kind of compartmentalized way, but give yourself to some of your impulses. On a certain day, if I realize I've got something to do, and I'm like, but today I feel like actually being on the beach, then you can be on the beach and come back and revisit your schedule and change what you're doing. And when you give in to that impulse, it connects you with something that's primitive about yourself. Now, I'm sure people are thinking, yeah, that sounds great for you, but I've got such a tough schedule, and I've got to look after my kids, and I've got to come home and leave. Well, I think we put ourselves into this whole sort of into these chains for reasons that are not entirely clear, but which I do have some thoughts about. As you probably know, one of my favorite quotes is a Kierkegaard quote, which is that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. That when we are free, we say we want to be free, but when we are free, we actually become really anxious because it's like being without gravity.
Yeah.
And so we try to weigh ourselves down with life's duties so that we don't have to be free and we can authentically complain about it. So, I often will say to people, if you feel like your life is packed in that way, then, ask yourself, how can I build in some time to not pack my life in that way? And how can I build in some time so that I'm not caught up in these chains that are completely limiting my life? Because it's not just about the theory of what I'm saying or about whether what I'm saying is right or wrong. If we project out into the future, probably the thing we're projecting out to is a way in which we can think about our lives. And when we think about our lives that way, we actually can realize that when I think about my life, I think, well, what would the music in me be that I want to be played out? And I'm quoting someone whose name I can't remember right now, about the fact that we don't play out our lives when we do that. I'm liking how I'm getting an unusual number of texts on this device shortly.
Oh, is that what's knocking it over?
Yeah.
I was
like, do
thinking
like
we should make a blooper
7,000.
reel of this, but we should just leave this in because
Like,
this is real life stuff right here.
right. I'm like,
You
well,
know,
everybody
normally
stop.
we'd be doing this over a Wi-Fi connection that's supposed to be super stable, but any of you watching or listening, that is
Right.
getting more challenging as the years go by. So more often than not, instead of Wi-Fi or Ethernet, we just have to go over phones. Sometimes they get tipped over when you get texts.
Right, right. So I'm like, why is everybody texting only now?
Murphy's
But
Law, I think.
yeah, probably trying to unsettle me about something that
Right.
we're-
Get
that
you
we're
all
talking
scattered,
about.
distracting you from your point.
Yeah, but I feel like life is short. You live, you die, you do something in between. I think if you use that as a guidepost, it's really helpful in terms of how you make choices in your life. And for those people who feel like they don't really have choices, I think it's more that we can't see our choices when we're not self-connected. Because when we are, like, we talked about like where you might live, for example. Like, I often think, there's a lot of stuff that's still, like, there are loose threads hanging around. Like, I live in a suburb of Boston, but I feel like my heart is in New York and LA. And my ostensible reason is that it's too expensive to move out to New York, which is true technically. But if that were really the reason, then why would I not say, I really want that? And so then think about the possibilities of spending the same amount of time doing something that will allow me to afford a place to stay in New York. Because if I really want to do that, and I would say that I don't think I've lived into that possibility enough. I don't think I've committed with my whole body to that possibility. And as we were talking about earlier, in terms of where you've moved to and how you live, I think you're so happy with where you are right now because it felt to me like your whole body was committed to that environment and that move. And I think embodied commitment it's really not talked about enough. My general feeling in psychiatry and in medicine is that the split between the mind and the body is just sort of absurd.
Yeah.
Like even a thing like commitment is something that, like when you're anxious, you clench your teeth. When I'm excited, I'm moving my hands. This is my body that's channeling some kind of emotion. So if I want to be committed to living in New York, rather than saying, well, in order to live in New York, I probably need much more money than I'm currently making. And so I'm not able to do that. And if you look at the apartments that are great, I mean, there are apartments that are absurdly priced, beautiful, $250 million. You're like, wow, that's an expensive apartment. Like, what do you have to do that? That sounds impossible. Well, the building's almost full, so it's not impossible. There are people who are doing something, probably spending less time working than I'm working, who have figured out how they want to do what they're doing. I probably don't want to do what they're doing, but my sense is they were more committed to that vision.
Right.
So they were able to live a life to be able to fulfill that vision. And so, when I think about it, I'm absurdly excited about my life because of the different things that I do. And I get up with a spring in my step. I feel I'm one of those annoying people who's sort of like that. Like I'm excited from the time I get up to the time I go to sleep. And even when something awful happens, which is often when you're an entrepreneur,
Sure.
I'm just sort of like, okay, like next, like how do I move into this next? Because I like this. I like thinking about the brain. I like thinking about the human psyche. I'm very fortunate to be working personally with people I truly love, and I've been working with them for a long time. So, those things are awesome that they're happening. If they're not happening, like in the way my New York apartment is not happening, or the $250 million apartment is not happening, it's like, well, I mean, it is kind of a stretch. Like, I don't think I can stretch my mind from where I am to saying, I'm going to do something different tomorrow so that I'll be able to buy a $250 million apartment and have, a few dollars left over for a hot dog, which we've talked about before. But I think that we can scale back on those possibilities until we get to a point where we say, well, what amount of money that's greater than what you're making right now can you be committed to? And I would say for me as a practitioner, this has been one of the biggest changes that I think I've made in my own practice, that rather than only talking about memory and how you can revisit what's happened so you can correct things in the here and now and move into the future, I really encourage people to also spend time living into possibilities and committing to them in an all-in kind of way. And I think you would be an amazing person to talk about the all-inness, because from the time I met you, I think I noticed that you had an all-inness about you. And I'm interested to know from you as well, how you think that all-inness happened in your life.
It wasn't always all-inness, I think, is the answer to that. You have to experience the opposite of that and be like, this is not what I want.
Right.
And then it becomes, so you find the edges and then you find your way back to the sweet spot, is how I like to explain that. But for me, it's really through, going to an Ivy League school was a double-edged sword. And for a long time, I thought that it was just like everything, right? My education was, I'd worked so hard for it. I went into debt for it, and I worked so hard to get out of debt for it and all this stuff. But when you really take a step back, it's like, I didn't learn about spirituality and deeper meaning from an Ivy League college. I learned that from the woods and from going across the world and meeting people I never thought could exist in this reality. You know what I mean? It came from all these other things and breaking myself over and over again. And also, it's almost 10 years to the day. It was Easter. 10 years ago, I lost everything I had in a fire in Austin 6 months after I moved there. And that's just as I had paid off my debt. So I was completely broke and just like hit rock bottom. And I think once you've hit that kind of rock bottom in whatever way in your life, you can hopefully find a way to navigate out of it so that you never have to be there again. And that makes it easier to go all in, and makes it easier to be like, okay, once you've been publicly humiliated, I was engaged in my early 20s. It was a public and embarrassing breakup to me. It wasn't to anyone else. No one else really cared, right? Because it happens all the time. But like all these things just kind of broke me over and over again. And then I'm only 34 now, but I feel like for the past 5 or so years, it's been a deep search to try to get back in touch with what my 8-year-old self would have wanted to grow up into. So sometimes I even imagined like, wow, I just time traveled from being 8 years old as kind of a mental exercise. What am I going to do today? What do I want to do now? And if it weren't for that, I wouldn't be writing this poetry. I wouldn't be playing or learning jazz piano for the first time. I've never actually done that. I always wanted to. I'm mostly a guitarist and singer. And so just like exploring all these things and making yourself a beginner is big. And I'll add one other thing to that. I think that's so important that you'll definitely appreciate, Srini. When you play music, and I think when you play sports too, but like certainly with music, I tend to play for an hour, maybe 2 hours in the morning, practicing on piano and guitar. And you're making mistakes constantly. You know that they're mistakes. That's kind of the whole point. You're bad. You're making yourself bad every time you practice. You're not supposed to practice the things that you're good at. You're practicing the things that you're bad at, right? So you get used to making those mistakes, and that somehow spills over to the rest of your life, where it's easier to be all in because you're not self-censoring, kind of like you were saying before. When you're on social media, you have to think about what other people are thinking of you. And if you're in that state, you can't be all in.
Yeah, I really like what you're pointing out. Also, it resonates deeply with me, and especially the jazz piano bit. So I trained in classical piano, and in recorded, and I studied music, and then I went to medical school, and I couldn't spend. I used to practice 6-7 hours a day, and so I felt like I was really immersed in it. Yeah. And then I went to medical school, and then that's what happened with my 6 to 7 hours. And I realized at a certain point, though, that you can say goodbye to a lot of things, but music is a lover. It's just impossible to say goodbye. I tried. Didn't work. It just doesn't. And so I decided that the way I would cope with my ego fracturing, knowing that I had not practiced for many years, was I would hire a jazz piano teacher. So that way I wouldn't feel badly about the fact that I wasn't as good at classical piano. I was sort of just beginning to get to concert levels. I was feeling fluent. I was composing. And suddenly I was like, oh, I'll do jazz piano, because then I won't be hard on myself about the fact that I'm not good at this because I haven't actually studied jazz piano. So I hired this teacher, and I was working with him, and we worked together for a while. And then I was like, God, I hate being so bad at this. Right. Like, this is so awful that, I used to play so fluently, and now I'm like, playing like as if I've never played piano before. And, and I was like, this is not like the bicycle story. It's like if you haven't been practicing for a while, you get rusty at it. the opposite of the deliberate practice thing. But I was like, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to understand what I feel. And what I felt was I really did not like not being fluent at playing jazz piano. So I came to my music lesson one day and I said to my piano teacher, can you please take the seat at the piano? He was like, what are you talking about? And I said, I had a sudden impulse today that I want to sing and I want to find my ugly, because I think there's something in my voice that I'm avoiding, literally and figuratively. Mm-hmm. And he was like, well, what do you mean? I said, well, I keep on singing in this kind of, comfortable range, but I'm not stretching my capacity, my vocal cord. So he said, well, what would you like to sing? And I said, I don't know, but please start playing as soon as I start singing. And he was like, what key, what time, like what? I said, 1, 2, and I'm just starting to sing. And he looked at me, and I composed 42 songs that year that ended up becoming the musical that I wrote.
No way.
Because I just decided that there was something going on there. I didn't know what it was, but I sang all of it, and then I looked at it and I was like, I must be singing about something. So I went around and I wrote down the titles of each thing, had all the notation, and I was like, I think there's a theme to what this is. Reorganized the music into a story, and then went back and edited it a couple times. And so now I'm at a point where I'm doing the final notation before I produce it. But that all came from wanting to find my ugly and recognizing that I could not tolerate. That's an example where you can't tolerate being bad at something, but composition doesn't really leave you. Like composition, if you've been doing it for a while, sort of stays with you, and there are places you can go with, and you can experience the fluency. And so I feel like I turned what could have been a really bad situation, because I was getting so annoyed with how bad I was at the jazz piano compared to how I was.
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't want to go through this thing of like, oh, I've added one more song to my repertoire. Oh, and I've got another song to my repertoire. And it's getting a bit better. Like, I want to throw myself into this. And I think the fact that you turn to music to describe an aspect of your all-inness, I deeply resonate with, because music is a place where I experience my all-inness as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of people do if they're honest about it. Because it's another interesting thing that happens, because there is this dichotomy between... have you seen what Jeff Goldblum is up to with the jazz piano? He released an album last year. It's really good. He's good and has been playing and been really good for a long time. But he describes it as the joy of discipline. He discovered the joy of discipline, where and it's interesting too, because he wakes up in the morning and practices piano, and that's kind of like a common theme that I've seen in very artistic, kind of inspired, all in people. I mean, he, as an actor anyway, he definitely personifies that sort of eccentric, right, just off the wall, all in all the time. And that's kind of what you want. But it has to be this combination of that kind of joy of discipline combined with, it sounds like for you, the musical and the poetry book was like this for me. It's not like you had this intention that was totally clear and you were striving for it and you were working really hard and making sacrifices until you had this musical. It's like it kind of appeared not out of nowhere, right? But like it molded itself almost a little bit, right?
Yeah, and in fact, there are studies that do attest to the fact, this thing about being connected to whatever your primitive core is. Like I started writing a piece about this recently, and I asked the question, why do we all appreciate Serena Williams's roar, or great dancers hip thrusting, or like there's something about when people connect to their primitive selves, we're like transfixed.
Yeah.
Because in part it reminds us that there's that level of ambition somewhere within us, that there's that level of commitment somewhere within us. And I think when I put myself in this position with the music, I was just like, I want to also connect to something that feels more primitive. And there are parts of this musical, because a lot of it is about the characters in the main character's head, that even feel a little bit Wagnerian, in the sense that they kind of like don't make sense. Like you're like, what is going on? Like they don't make sense. And I think part of what I wanted to do was that the kind of sense that they make is the kind of sense you feel, but you can't really tease out in logic.
Yeah.
And the studies that have looked at creative scientists and artists have found that number one, they engage in imagination a lot. So they actually make mental pictures and mental movies. And secondly, in the midst of making those mental movies, there are these primitive forms that just come together that start to express something. And I was thinking about, there's a humorous part, I'll share a little bit about one of the characters. One of the things I wanted to address is how all of us are embodied with this kind of sadomasochistic tension, hurting ourselves, hurting others, trying to deal with, how not to do either. And when I introduced masochism as the mental character, I thought it was sort of amusing, but also slightly primitive, that the character was singing, all I do is hurt me, hurt me, hurt me. I was like, what? There's like a person like that in our heads, who's like, it was so absurd to be singing this thing in the form of a musical, to be like having this character celebrate the fact that that's what they do.
Yeah.
But the truth is, I would say two brain facts about that are true. Firstly, these kinds of self-oriented attacks are quite common in all of us. And it's important to be aware of that. So when you see that on stage, it's sort of, like a remarkable reminder of that. And the other thing about the disorder is that brain studies are now showing that entropy, the degree of disorder in one's brain, actually correlates with a higher degree of intelligence. That the more options your brain can generate for any given situation, the more likely it is that you'll solve what exists. But if you just think in a very narrow and confined way, and there isn't this constant communication, you're limiting your intelligence. So when I emphasize these points, like be aware of deliberate practice, or grit is not everything, or use your imagination, or have a sense of possibility, or live on the wild side, or I know they all sound like very idealistic notions. And so my thought is, it's difficult to jump from where most of us are to live doing all of that all the time. But I think if we can just choose one of those things, just to turn the dial up a little bit on our lives, and to say, I want to make one change. I think it's far less overwhelming. And I think for people who want to practice that, choosing one or two things and then realizing what's in that world, I think can make a huge difference to your life. I mean, when I read your poetry book, how did that poetry come through you?
That is an excellent question.
Because it didn't sound like it was manufactured. It sounded like it might have been edited from time to time, but mostly it sounded like it just came through you.
Yeah, it did. Some of them, honestly, I wrote when I was about 14 or 15 years old, and I was going back through them after my parents had moved, and I was just kind of going through, this is kind of cool old stuff. And like the poem that I wrote about the pumpkins, which is kind of one of the more political ones, was actually written when I was 15, when the Bush administration, around 9/11 and all that. And so in reading my old poetry, I was just like, I don't, oddly enough, think of myself always as an artist. And I certainly didn't, after like everyone saying, you're a health guy, you're a big health guy, over and over again, right? After this was kind of the thing that got big, that starts brainwashing you a little bit. And it took one of my best friends from high school, Will, who was on this podcast not long ago. He's an 8th grade teacher of world cultures and English. And he wrote a couple of poetry books, mostly for his kids. And I read through those and I was like, well, if my best friend is doing it, why can't I do something like that? And so I just kind of sat down and had this space. This was before I had really focused on practicing for 2 hours a day again, which is what I'm doing now, because I kind of shift that focus. But for just a couple of months, I just sat down whenever something felt like it was coming through. I would think of a funny rhyme, or it was just there, and then it would come out. I'd sit down and I'd write it. But I don't think, honestly, that's totally fair, because even before that, I don't know if you saw some of the live looping music videos that I've been doing with just a bunch of different instruments in virtual reality or whatever, but that was something I was doing kind of because of writer's block. I did 400 improv music videos on a bunch of instruments that I don't play, and I was trying to. It reminds me of your experience kind of with the jazz instructor, where I'm just like, bah! Like I have no idea what's going to happen. Let's hit play, and sometimes I do 10 in a night. And most of them were really bad and it's just completely silly. But then the poetry just started to flow out of me after I did 400 of those. You know, some of them are decent, but most of them are not. It was more of an exercise, like you were talking about, to kind of get things flowing. And that's what you need, isn't it?
I think so. I think part of what we're talking about is what you can do to get things flowing, not to get things right.
Yes.
You know, when you do something to get things flowing, you discover things. Like, you can't really discover anything if you know everything, right? I mean, it's sort of like, if you know everything, there's nothing to discover. But if you turn things up so that you get started in some process, like what you said about the improvisational instruments, I've had that experience. I've had the experience trying to play a trumpet and having no sound come out of it.
Yeah.
And being like, what is going on? Even like clarinet. You know, I was playing recorder and I was very practiced at it. I was good at it. And I was like, oh, clarinet, that must be easy. So I took the clarinet and I'm like, nothing is happening. There's no sound coming out of it.
Right.
But then you learn, you know, like what you need to do when you play with reed instruments and how you wet things and how sound. It's an awesome thing to jumpstart your life. And I think that most of us, like when I think about my life, certainly, and the lives of anyone I'm working with, part of what I would love for people to feel is this feeling of electricity, which is literally, you know, what's coursing through our body.
Yeah.
But to really tap into that electricity by jump-starting our lives, by choosing something like that, and then seeing where it goes, not giving up on it. I think what happens is with a lot of people, like when you were describing being with the musical instruments, like it sounded like you were just into it. You're like, I don't care if I'm good or bad. Like, I'm just going to play, sing, like do something. And so all of a sudden you're in that zone, and it's the zone of experimentation. And the zone of experimentation, I think, is where you find the promise of being alive at a very different place in your life. And I think science is sort of amazing at teaching the process of experimentation. But there are a lot of people, Einstein, for example, who talk about the fact that speculation is much more important than people realize, that taking a huge leap forward and then reverse engineering that is probably much more effective, because when you just think your way into a sensible place forward, then you're not jumping that far. But I would say to somebody, what's like the most outrageous thing that you could possibly be thinking that you're doing that would keep you safe and others around you safe and leave your life intact? So let's say those are the only limits. You know, what could you possibly be doing? You know, and I think there's so many things that we could all be doing if we allowed ourselves to speculate. You know, Carrie Banks Mullis, who I mentioned in my book as well, who's discovered a synthetic way of making DNA. His colleagues hated him because he just didn't follow the very sort of regular, logical, scientific process. He was just driving from Berkeley to Mendocino. You know, suddenly thought of something, wrote it in a wall. You know, his girlfriend was asleep. He had had some wine along the way. I mean, this is not what they teach you when they teach you how to design experiments. You know, they're like, you know, be clear, have a clear mind, be methodical, go from point A to point B. And I feel like what I often feel is that when I hear rational thought that shapes our intellects, I believe it, because I believe our innate intelligence is much more primordial, is much more associative, is much more wild. And rational thought brings some order to that. But when rational thought is your intelligence, it's a problem. Because I feel like then you're not actually touching base with that particular shape. You're just making your intelligence in a kind of structural way. You know, it's what I think differentiates great architects from not great architects. Great architects have a feeling deep inside of them that they then bring out into a structure. Yeah. And so I think if you're not connected to that feeling and you're not connected to that drive, that it doesn't matter what the rational thought is, it's not going to serve you.
I love that. I can't believe it, but we're almost out of time. I want to make sure we quickly touch on one more thing with you specifically, because there's a whole lot of hubbub about it recently. Transcranial direct stimulation. Having this podcast and stuff, I get all sorts of devices sent to me, and I have a couple of brain-shocking devices. And ethically and morally, I'm a little freaked out. But where do you stand on that whole thing?
So I mean, I guess there are two things to say about that. One is that from a research perspective, there's a decent amount of research on different kinds of transcranial brain stimulation, and there certainly is a decent amount of pilot data to show that it can change depression. It can help with a number of different outcomes. So I think as a methodology, it's fairly safe if administered by people who know how to use it in a laboratory setting where there are safety devices in case something goes wrong. I think from my own perspective, I am very interested in it for a number of reasons. We live in an age where we talk a lot about brain chemistry, and we try to change our mental states chemically, using medications or drugs. But electricity is part of, when we think about how the brain works, electricity is a way that it works. So adding an electrical intervention could actually be helpful to people. My personal philosophy on those kinds of things is I stick to martinis for external stimuli, and I think anything else that's going to shock me or change my chemistry too much, I ignore, because I feel like there's so much. Because I imagine if I felt what I have a lot of friends who use those kinds of devices or chemistry to alter their chemistry because they need to. I think personally, I think there's a decent amount of safety associated with it. I think it can help things like depression. There are instances of post-traumatic stress disorder where it's been helpful. So I think that it could be helpful. But I think there's a lot more research that needs to be done to make sure that it's safe. Because if you have a pacemaker, if you have a lesion in your brain already, if you have magnetic things that could change in your body that could change what's going on. I wonder about that. I'm also interested in the fact that hemoglobin itself is magnetic, and so I wonder what the long-term effects on blood flow will be with transcranial stimulation.
I remember doing a bunch of MRI studies in college, the Max, I think, and it was unpleasant. I can tell you, being inside that machine for a time. Right. But I got a lot of pictures in my brain out of it, which is great.
Yeah.
But anyway, Srini, what's the best place to find you, and what are you working on? What's coming next?
Well, so right now I'm doing a bunch of different things, and I'm working on an app for anxiety. I'm putting together a book proposal that looks at how we distort ourselves, and as a result, have depression and anxiety as signals that remind us that we need to figure out how to get back into connection with ourselves. I'm at drsrinipillay.com, which is DRSRINIPILLAY.com. I am also on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. I can certainly give you the links so that people can click on them to follow what I'm writing about, and would love to have more people join in the conversations that I'm starting, because it matters to me what people would like to learn more about, and there's so much to write about that I'd rather write about stuff that people care about. So look me up, see if it appeals to you, and if it does, please join me on social media so we can have some rich conversations.
The breadth of Srini's work is inspiring, and your work is so important. I really appreciate it, Srini. We'll have to have you back on many more times. Maybe we'll just make it an annual thing. Keep checking in on you.
That sounds awesome.
All right. Thanks again.
Thank you, Abel. I love talking to you always. Thanks a lot.
Well, hey, folks. This is Abel James once more, as promised, returning with a special reading from my brand spanking new book, Designer Babies Still Get Scabies. Before we get to that reading, this review just came in from across the pond, and since it's the very first one, I wanted to read it. It made me smile. He says, "Funny, wise, wacky, smiley face. A book that delivers on many levels. Great gift for anyone who thinks, talks, or reads more than they watch the boob tube. Thanks, Abel, and best from an American in Spain. Best to you from the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. And thank you so much for leaving the first review, and thanks for the 5 stars. Really appreciate it. Those of you out there, if you dig this, don't forget your reviews really help. Let's start with one, since both Srini and I come out of the Ivy League, one called Progress with a question mark. Progress? Typing with our thumbs makes us feel quite dumb. Whether an Ivy League alum, a certified master of Scrum, or somebody's daddy or mom, Phones assault us with their scum until our brains go numb. Related to this week's show, isn't it? How about another one related to this week's show and extremely timely considering Black Friday, Cyber Monday, Christmas time, buying all these gifts with money that nobody has. This one's called The Consumers, and you can probably infer my take from this reading. All right, this one's pretty long. There's some longer poems that are kind of like marathons in here. Let's see if I can get through it without messing up too much. But if you folks want to try some of my longer ones, reading them as quickly as possible, please do record yourself and send it to me. It's very entertaining. I've already gotten a few. All right, this one's called The Consumers. There's more to life, I presume, than to consume. Filling our bellies noon to noon, blowing our bodies up like balloons, trashing billions of plastic spoons, sitting scared in our cocoons. Idolizing greedy, disgusting tycoons, using oceans as petrochemical spittoons, making dumps of all the lagoons, treating rivers like our bathrooms. Spewing smoke out by the plume, turning dinosaurs to dirty fumes. Testing poisons on baby baboons, murdering whales with rusty harpoons, sniping all the endangered loons, fracking every less prairie and dune, shooting rockets straight to the moon, firing fireworks from June to June, hoping we're all immune to the reckoning that looms. Fierce hurricanes and unprecedented monsoons, deadly wildfires and Cat 5 typhoons. Heat waves cook every plum to prune, while we get sloshed and sloppy at saloons, swallowing deep-fried crab rangoons on our infinite honeymoons. Companies and capitals ruled by goons, sacred rituals in corporate ballrooms, $10,000 slave labor suits on all the grooms, shopping for new shoes every afternoon, nibbling manufactured plastic macaroons, sucking coke by the tablespoon, believing political cartoons, recruiting more platoons, electing more buffoons, hypnotized by the croon of atomic warheads that go boom. At this rate, we'll be marooned and dragooned on Mars or Neptune, which would be inopportune. But friends, it's not all doom and gloom. Buffoons will be lampooned when I'm in the room. You see, we've all been groomed to believe we live in a vacuum, but our reality wears a costume. If we just plant flowers and let them bloom, swap fast food for our favorite legumes, ditch toxic chemicals in food and perfumes, get more heart in the boardrooms, more love in our bedrooms, grow a few backyard heirlooms, feed kids veggies in the lunchrooms, teach some truth in the classrooms. We'll see there's more to life from womb to tomb than to consume. Ha! That's a long one, right? Okay. How about another one relating to this week's show with Dr. Srini Pillay, Harvard neuroscientist? My phone is spying on me. My phone is spying on me. They say it's quite good for the economy. Your phone is spying on you. It's watching every little thing you do. Pretty soon it'll be in your brain as we calmly hand AI the reins. I don't care if they're making it rain. Transhumanism is insane. And I stand by it. I'm not going to get one of those silly brain implants. All right, let's finish this off with a quick one. It's a computer joke for the programmers out there. As a recovering programmer myself, I relate to this one. Press any key to continue. Please press any key to continue. But always remember, the truth is within you. Once again, folks, thank you so much for your support, for grabbing this book, for leaving your reviews one more time. You can grab it, and when you get the paperback version, you get a free audiobook as well. Just go to designerbabiesbook.com or grab the book from Amazon, and don't forget to check out some of my other books as well. This is Abel James signing off, and we'll see you next week. This episode is brought to you by Wild Superfoods. Big news! After 3+ years of nonstop tasting and testing, our brand new real food health supplements from Wild Superfoods are finally ready for you. Now, what does wild mean anyway? Well, we work with the laws of nature, not against them. We avoid anything artificial, genetically modified, or overly processed. Whether you need real food nutrition from fruits, veggies, and stress-fighting adaptogens in Future Greens, vitamins from Vitamin D Stack, balanced omegas in Mega Omegas, or immune-boosting probiotics in Probiotic Spheres, we have got you covered. Our shelf-stable nutraceuticals are of uncompromising quality, and they're convenient options for traveling, camping, emergency and disaster preparedness, as well as daily supplementation for optimal health. At Wild Superfoods, each of our products is lab tested for purity and potency and formulated according to the latest cutting-edge developments in research, science, and medicine. Guaranteed nutrition no matter where you are. That's our promise to you, and we look forward to hearing how you like Wild Superfoods. And as a listener of Fat Burning Man, you can save over $80 on a one-time purchase or save over $128 when you select subscribe and save. On top of that, you'll get free access to our coaching and meal planning community, the Fat Burning Tribe, which is normally $27 a month. All you have to do is head on over to wildsuperfoods.com. All you have to do, type it in right now into that menu bar on your phone, tablet, computer, or anything else, VR goggles you might be using right now. Just check out wildsuperfoods.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you there. Well, hey there, listener. This is Abel one more time, and I just want to say thank you for listening to this episode of the Fat Burning Man Show. If you liked it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button wherever you might be listening to or watching this show right now. And if you have a second, please leave me a quick review for the Fat Burning Man Show. I read every single one of them, and every time you leave a review, it gives us a little boost in the rankings, and that helps other people find this show. And if you can think of someone else who might enjoy and benefit from this free show, please take a second to share it with a friend or a family member. And if they're like, what is this Fat Burning Man thing? That's a really silly name. You could be like, you're right, but here's the deal. We've recorded over 250 episodes of the Fat Burning Man Show with thought leaders in health from all over the world. And so far, we've won 4 awards, hitting #1 in health in more than 8 countries internationally. We have more than 30 million downloads already, but we're just getting started. I can't believe any of this, by the way, and couldn't do any of this without you, so thanks once again. But here's some more good news. You can download and listen to every single episode of the Fat Burning Man Show for free with 0 outside advertisements, no outside sponsors, and no corporate overlords. All you have to do is type in fatburningman.com. I'll give you a second here just to type it in, fatburningman.com. And you'll get all the show notes, transcripts, and video and audio versions for all the past episodes of the Fat Burning Man Show for free. Better yet, enter your email at fatburningman.com, sign up for my newsletter, and I'll even send you a quick start guide so you can take your health into your own hands right now, along with a few of our ridiculously tasty recipes as a special thanks for signing up. Once again, just go to fatburningman.com right now, enter your best email to get your free goodies with a bonus surprise straight to your inbox. This is Abel James signing off. Thank you so much for listening once again, and have a great week.